European Union might suggest. And it's important to be clear that a youth mobility scheme is not freedom of movement. When we already have schemes with Uruguay, with Japan, with Canada, with New Zealand, Australia, we can absolutely see there are strict conditions on when somebody can come here. So can the Minister just update us on when he next expects to discuss this with the European Union?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, Mr Speaker, and of course we discuss a range of issues with our partners and friends in the European Union. As I said, I'm not going to give a running commentary on those discussions. We've been very clear that we won't return to freedom of movement or rejoin the European Union.
Alex Beck.
Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And with permission, I'll answer questions number 2 and number 21 together. Alongside our G7 allies, I can confirm that the UK's support for Ukraine is absolutely ironclad. We've already been clear that we'll provide Ukraine with £3 billion a year in military support for as long as needed. We're investing in Ukraine's defence industrial base. We're ratcheting up the pressure on Putin's war machine and on third country supplies. And I'm delighted today that the Chancellor has announced that we will provide £2.26 billion in additional support to Ukraine as part of the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans to Ukraine scheme.
Alex Baker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Ukraine is facing a difficult winter. What steps is this government taking to help ensure Ukraine is in the best possible position to be able to deal with the challenges that this will bring?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her very important question, and I completely agree with her. Putin's attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure have increased the vulnerability of millions of Ukrainians ahead of this winter, and they are shocking and they are barbarous. And that is exactly why I have announced and signed up £20 million additional support to Ukraine's energy system, and we're working with partners across Europe and across the G7 to support them in this area.
Luke Akehurst.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree with me that Ukraine's rightful place is with other European democracies in the NATO alliance?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his important question. He will know that the NATO Secretary-General was here in London very recently alongside President Zelensky, and the Prime Minister welcomed them along with the Foreign Secretary. Our allies have made clear that Ukraine's future is in NATO, and indeed at Washington they confirmed that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership, and I can confirm that we will play a leading role in supporting Ukraine's pathway to membership.
Roger Gale.
Given that answer, Mr Speaker, does the Foreign Service consider that the reported presence of the Secretary-General for the United Nations at Putin's summit in Russia will be helpful or unhelpful to Ukraine? And if the latter, what's he doing about it?
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. Obviously, the meetings that the United Nations Secretary-General chooses to tender a matter for him, not for the government. We, of course, continue to work with a wide range of allies to support Ukraine across the G7, as we've done today with that announcement, and, of course, with our partners in Europe.
Mark Blitchart.
Does the Minister share my concern of worrying reports of North Korean troops fighting for Russia in Ukraine, and what message would he give from the dispatch box day to Pyongyang?
Well, I absolutely share his concerns, and indeed the Foreign Secretary has been clear that we condemn in the strongest terms DPRK's continued unlawful arms transfers and the reported deployments of its troops to the Russian Federation to support the unlawful war of aggression in Ukraine. And that's not only in violation of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions, but it will also prolong the suffering of Ukrainian people and threatens global security, so we condemn it in absolute terms.
Mr Speaker, to move us beyond the condemnation, the last week troops have arrived from North Korea in Russia. They are training in Russian fatigues based on videos we have seen. In addition, we know that Russia has procured multiple weapons to aid the merge of Ukrainians from North Korea. Putin has seized the escalation ladder. So will the Minister now not declare North Korea a combatant in the renewed illegal invasion of Ukraine, demarche the North Korean charge, and confirm what unilateral and multilateral action we will be taking in response to this?
Well, I thank the Shadow Minister for her points on this. As I said, we absolutely condemn what North Korea is reported to have been doing, and indeed, of course, you'll have seen in the response to the Iranian transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia that we acted strongly, swiftly and firmly, and we are very closely monitoring what Russia is providing to the DPRK in return for its provision of arms and military personnel. And we are deeply concerned about the potential for further transfers, including of ballistic missile-related technology. That would obviously jeopardise peace and stability not only in Ukraine but indeed across the world, and we condemn it absolutely.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 3.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer the honourable gentleman's question along with number 20. The government inherited a situation where the long-term secure operation of the Diego Garcia military base was under threat. The agreement that we have reached secures the future of the base and strengthens our role in safeguarding global security. And of course, the agreement is subject to the finalisation of a treaty which the government intends to complete in the coming months. And Parliament, Mr. Speaker, will have the opportunity to scrutinise the treaty in the usual manner following its signature.
Nigel Farage.
Since the mistaken opening of negotiations by the last government on the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands, it turns out the British High Commissioner and others appear to have been bugged by the government of Mauritius. If the police investigation into this proves to be true, and we can see that Mauritius, their government at least, are bad actors, in the light of that, is the 99-year-old lease that you've got on Diego Garcia even worth the paper that it's written on?
Well, of course, we note the reports with significant concern, but the honourable gentleman would understand that I'm not going to comment on an ongoing police investigation. As I pointed out yesterday, these obviously relate to historical conversations, not during the current round of negotiations, and we're absolutely confident that we've achieved a treaty that meets both our national security objectives, closes off a migration route, but also fundamentally respects the interests of Chagosian people.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you. How can the Minister continue defending the ceding of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius when China is rapidly expanding its influence in the Indo-Pacific? Yes. With no binding agreement against Chinese military involvement in the future, has the government recklessly compromised British and Allied security just to appease vested interests?
Well, I completely reject what the honourable gentleman suggests, and this idea that somehow Mauritius is in hock to China, or that somehow it opens up a place for China. Let me be absolutely clear. Mauritius is one of only 2 African countries that haven't signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. There is absolutely no way that we would have signed off a treaty, nor indeed the United States, across the national security apparatus, one that compromised any of our security interests or those of our allies. And let me be clear, the unequivocal support from the United States President, the Secretary of State, to the Defence Secretary and across the establishment makes clear that this is the right deal for our security and that of our allies.
Deirdre Costigan.
4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer the Honourable Lady's question alongside also questions 6, 13, 14, 16, 19 and 22. Mr. Speaker, October is likely to see the least aid enter Gaza since the start of the conflict. That is unacceptable. As the Foreign Secretary stated on the 16th of October, the UK is pressing Israel alongside our partners to allow the aid into Gaza that is so clearly needed in this desperate situation, and to enable the UN and its humanitarian partners to operate effectively.
Deirdre Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with the West London Islamic Centre in my constituency of Ealing Southall, and they told me that they are deeply concerned about the plight of severely injured children in Gaza who need urgent medical help. Could the Minister outline what work she is doing to ensure these children get access to the very best medical attention?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this important issue, and also to her constituents and the very many people across the UK who are determined to do what they can. Of course, we've seen that also with the UK public's response to the DEC appeal, matched by this government's £10 million. Now, she asked specifically about young children who have been caught up and who have been injured. The extent of disease and injury is significant and deeply concerning. We've provided significant support, including through UK Med, for their field hospital in Gaza. And last week, my honourable friend announced £1 million to the Egyptian Ministry of Health to support medically evacuated Palestinians from Gaza.
Will Stone.
Many residents from Swindon North have contacted me expressing their concerns about Gaza. What steps is the Minister taking to help improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. We see people up and down the country who are very concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Clearly, we now have extreme levels of food insecurity. We're very concerned about the situation in northern Gaza in particular. We have been very clear, including to all actors in the region, via the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and all of us in the ministerial team, that there must be access to the aid that is so desperately needed in all of Gaza.
Anna Dixon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since the devastating Hamas attack on Israel over a year ago, an estimated 42,000 Palestinians have died, including many civilians, and many more families have been repeatedly displaced. Will the Minister or Secretary of State assure me and my constituents that the Government are using the full diplomatic force of the British Government to secure an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and to allow the free flow of humanitarian aid?
Yes, I can. A resolution to this conflict has been a priority since day one of the new government. We are calling for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages still cruelly detained by Hamas, and for much more aid to enter Gaza. The death and destruction in Gaza is intolerable, and we have made that clear at every possible moment.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Speaker, I declare an interest as a former board member of the Disasters Emergency Committee, but I am delighted to see the British public's generous response to their appeal. I know its member agencies are doing everything in their power to get aid to those who need it, but one of their member agencies, Islamic Relief, told me yesterday about the situation in Jabalia, where people, I quote, are being starved, bombed and shot on site. What conversations has the Minister had with Israeli counterparts to end the indiscriminate attacks on people in Gaza and let in the life-saving aid that the British public are so generously supporting?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, my honourable friend, for her question, and again I repeat our gratitude to the DEC for their work in ensuring that there has been that emergency appeal for the Middle East. Of course, I should have mentioned earlier it's covering Gaza, but also Lebanon, the broader Middle East as well, because there is that humanitarian need that is so urgent. I can reassure her that on issues of access to aid, the UK Government has been ensuring that we've been crystal clear on the need for this, the maintenance of international humanitarian law right across the region, and of course that includes with Israel as well. The Foreign Secretary underlined that indeed at the end of last week.
Dr Zabir Hamad.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister reassure me that the arms licence ban, export licence ban that we made in September to Israel covers items that we reasonably believe could be used to breach international law in Gaza? And can she further reassure me that the remaining export licences that go to Israel largely do not cover licences going to the IDF or indeed cover military equipment?
Okay, we asked our quick. That's fine.
Sorry, we've got one person answering the...
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do want to be very clear, as I think there is some confusion on this point, which is so important. Mr Speaker, following the 2nd of September suspension, there are currently no extant UK export licences. I will repeat that again. No extant export licences for items to Israel we assess might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. There's only one exception, which is for F-35 components, and the Foreign Secretary has explained this to the House. My honourable friend is absolutely right to say that most licences for exports to Israel are absolutely not for the IDF, and I'm pleased to be able to put that on the record in the House. Thank you.
Neil O'Brien.
The footage of the children caught up in the fighting in Gaza is absolutely horrendous, and so is the footage of those who are held hostage still. Now, firstly, what is the Minister doing to ensure the protection of aid workers in Gaza and Lebanon? And secondly, given that she's just told us that our efforts to get more aid in are not working, what are her next ideas? Where are we going to go from here? Because clearly it's not working.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question, and we have indeed seen some extremely disturbing scenes. Of course, it's very important that we ensure that there is verified information in the fog of such a horrendous war, but I know that we will all have seen those scenes and be disturbed by them. Now, the UK Government is determined to do all that we can to ensure that aid is accessing those who need it. So we are using every opportunity that involves working with UN agencies, in detail. I've had many meetings with them. Of course, he will know that we've also resumed support for UNRWA. We've been in close contact with them, the World Food Programme, all others working on this, but also bilaterally with all of our partners who are working in the region, with a number of different countries working with us to try and ensure there is that access to aid that's so desperately needed.
Catherine Fuchs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for all she has done so far on this issue. But my constituents, including Damon and Annie, are extremely concerned that every day things are only getting worse, with the UN saying that all essential supplies for survival are running out, and given the abject conditions in North Gaza, the fact that humanitarian access is nearly non-existent is unconscionable. A year on from the conflict starting, we are still debating restrictions on the flow of aid by Israeli authorities. What more can she do to ensure the people dying of hunger, thirst and lack of medical care get the attention they need?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can only underline that the new UK government is doing all that we can to get aid in as quickly as possible, supporting trusted partners on the ground to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid. As was already mentioned during this debate, we have agreed to match up to £10 million of public donations to the Disasters Emergency Committee's Middle East Humanitarian Appeal. That is going to be providing life-saving aid, including medical supplies, shelter and clean water to people in need. That's on top of the support we released for UNRWA. But of course that aid then needs to get to the people who are desperately in need of it. And I would refer to the response I just made to a previous question on this point. We're using every avenue to advance that cause.
Baltus.
Mr. Speaker, the images coming out of northern Gaza have horrified many, as has the news of yet more indiscriminate bombing. And it's had many reaching into humanity's darkest periods for historical comparisons. Now, I don't know which of those is appropriate, but I do know that on each of those occasions we told ourselves this time was different, and yet it never was. Mr. Speaker, does the ministerial team realise that what they do now is what they would have done then? And if they do realise that, do they believe that the conversations they're having are enough? And if they don't, when will they actually act positively to bring about a ceasefire?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for his question. However, surely he must recognise that from the first day of this new government coming in to position, we have sought to do all we can to advance that cause of a ceasefire. And on the issue of international humanitarian law, which he rightly stated so clearly as being imperative, we have been consistently clear as a new government. Israel must comply with international humanitarian law. It must allow unfettered aid access. Our message is clear. Israel could and must do more to ensure that aid reaches civilians in Gaza, and we have upheld our legal requirements around that, as he will have seen in relation to the decisions taken around arms export licences.
Brendan O'Hara.
Last month, the Minister of State told this chamber, "We could not be clearer. Intentionally directing attacks on civilian objects is a war crime. Those attacks threaten civilian access to power, heating, water supply, impacting safety and livelihood of millions of Ukrainians." And she was absolutely right. But why is it that this government can't immediately call out Putin's war crimes the moment they happen, but they seem utterly incapable of doing that when the perpetrator is Netanyahu and when the victims are Palestinians?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do regret the tone of the honourable member's question. He surely can recognise the prioritisation from this new government to do all that we can to secure the ceasefire that is required. Repeated messages that have been conveyed from this government, not just messages, action, time and time again, making sure we play our part. That has been recognised internationally. The changes around UNRWA that we have made, for example, the commitment to the ICC and ICJ, and again making sure that we held to our legal requirements around arms exports. That is a government that is committed to international humanitarian law, Mr. Speaker.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, intercepted communications demonstrate that Hamas are struggling to find room in their warehouses for the aid that is arriving. So what action is the Minister going to take to make sure that UNRWA actually get that aid to the people that need it, desperately need it, we accept, when Hamas are preventing it from reaching the Palestinian population?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government is clear that UNRWA plays a vital role in saving lives in Gaza and providing much-needed food and basic services and supporting stability in the West Bank and wider region. Wherever there are allegations or reports that there may have been instances of activity that are unacceptable, for example, those that were covered by the Colonna report, we have stated very clearly to UNRWA they must be investigated. They did do that with the Colonna report, and indeed the UK Government has supported the implementation of the findings of that report, and we continue to discuss that in detail with UNRWA so that they can indeed operate in the manner that they are mandated to do by international law.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst I appreciate the comments made in respect of aid, does the Minister condemn the ethnic cleansing and annexation of northern Gaza under the General's plan, where aid is not being allowed to go into northern Gaza? And if so, what action is being taken against it to demonstrate the UK's strongest objection?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government is extremely concerned by the situation in northern Gaza. This morning I was discussing this with humanitarians. I have been just about every single day. We really see a deterioration in people's circumstances there in terms of health, access to aid. And as I said at the beginning of my statement, the fact that we've seen the lowest amount of aid, or will likely see it this month since the start of the conflict, is unacceptable. We are deeply concerned about the fact that now we've seen many people who have been displaced, not just once, twice or 3 times, but indeed up to 9 times. We will continue to argue for the need for humanitarian access to Gaza. Thank you.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the answer the Minister gave a few moments ago on UNRWA supplies were found in the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar's underground hideout. As my honourable friend said, the Hamas terrorists are struggling to find warehouse space to store all the misappropriated aid. So when will the government review their commitment to funding UNRWA and actually take action to stop the misappropriation of this aid?
Mr. Speaker, I would refer the honourable member to my previous response on this. The UK Government takes any such allegations very seriously. Of course, we have ensured that these are taken up with UNRWA, and indeed with the Colonna report we saw there a thorough investigation into allegations that have been made, some of which were proven. UNRWA has been taking action in order to deal with them. It really is important that neutrality is held to, and we as the UK have played our part by ensuring that they have the funding required to implement those recommendations.
Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the removal of the international terrorist Yahya Sinwar and the possibility of an amnesty for those who now release the 97 remaining hostages, what pressure is the government bringing to bear to urge Hamas to lay down their arms and release hostages, both of which are necessary for full, unfettered access for humanitarian relief in Gaza?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable member, of course, for raising this incredibly important issue, and the suffering of particularly the family and friends of the hostages is indescribable. The Foreign Secretary has met with them, particularly those who have UK links, so has the Prime Minister, and repeatedly they have ensured that the release of hostages must be prioritised. They have articulated that message time and time again, will continue to do so until the hostages are indeed able to return home, as they must be able to do.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Coexistence, Mr. Speaker, is inescapable, and a two-state solution is one day inevitable, as both Israelis and Palestinians are here to say. Just as the First Intifada ushered in the historic breakthrough at Oslo, so too Britain, with its deep regional connections, UN responsibilities and brilliant diplomatic service, has a key role in lifting people's eyes to a very different future. What discussions is the government having on this, building on the significant efforts started under the last government?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We don't always agree across the dispatch box, but I strongly agree with the Right Honourable Member's characterisation of the need for ultimately a two-state solution as the only way of delivering the peace and security that the people of Israel and Palestine also deserve. That's a long-term commitment of this government to make sure that we play our part in exercising leadership towards that two-state solution. But of course, as he would expect, we need to show what that can deliver. There's a huge amount of work ongoing around reconstruction. I've discussed this, for example, in detail with the World Bank, the survey that they've been conducting around need that will be required, making sure that's fully coordinated so that we can see that secure future for those who are in Gaza at the moment. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Colin Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The attacks saw more than 5 residential blocks razed to the ground. Some reached the hospital, some remain under the rubble. That is the account of Dr. Eid Sabah of Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, which he gave to the BBC yesterday. I've noted the Minister's qualified earlier response, but as the UN Special Envoy for the peace process warns that nowhere in Gaza is safe, does the Minister agree with me that the UK should now cease all arms exports to Israel?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, with all due respect, particularly to my county colleague, would urge him to look again at what I stated, which stipulated very clearly the legal grounds for that decision around arms exports, but also the clarity around the fact that the restrictions that have been placed on arms due to that legal regime, which the UK government was determined to fulfil, are because the other licences are not going to be used in the manner that some would suggest. You know, we're very clear about the need to fulfil our international responsibilities in that regard. And just if I may very briefly, Mr. Speaker, he talked about the role of healthcare workers within Gaza, and we would seek to pay tribute to all of those who have been delivering healthcare, many of them British citizens, UK Med, which the UK government has supported. We pay tribute to them.
Davis.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question. The Foreign Office works closely with our allies and partners to counter Iran's support for proscribed groups. They clearly include Hamas, as many members have mentioned already, Lebanese Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We currently have over 400 sanctions in place on Iran in response to their human rights violations, nuclear escalation and indeed terrorism. We also continue to hold Iran publicly accountable for their direct support, as my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, did in his intervention at the Security Council on the 25th of September.
Iran's malign activity and support for its proxies is destabilising the Middle East. Does the Minister agree with me this must end? And would he say a little bit more about what steps he's taking?
Thank you. I do agree. In all of our efforts in the region, we are clear Hamas and the other Iranian proxies that are doing so much to destabilise the region must stop, and we're working with our allies to that effect, including reviewing new measures that we can take.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For years, the Foreign Secretary and the Labour Party has promised to proscribe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the chief sponsor of global terrorism. Is the government going to take action to tackle terrorism and extremism in the UK, or is the government going to break yet another promise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I understand the question from the former Home Secretary, she's saying when she was the Home Secretary, she did not prescribe the IRGC. She thinks we should now, within 100 days. I say to my honourable friends, we will take the necessary action in the UK to prevent the IRGC from taking action on these streets, but we do not comment, as she knows well, on whether or not an organisation is under consideration for prescription in the normal way.
Jodie Gosling.
Thank you, Speaker. Question 7, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising the issue of illegal migration. This government is strengthening key international relationships to tackle organised immigration crime, increase returns and secure our borders. My department is also funding activity to address the drivers of irregular migration by improving the prospects of people in their home region, tackling humanitarian crises and targeting trafficking.
Jodie Gosling.
Thank you. Can the Minister please outline the ways in which the new government is working with our French partners in order to tackle the shared challenges of dangerous crossings across the Channel?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this important issue. In the UK Government has been absolutely determined to work with our key partners on these questions. Within my department also we have been focused on ensuring that we have support for what's often called upstream migration, the drivers of the reasons why people feel they have to leave their home country or region in the first place. That's included, for example, support to help refugees in Jordan stay in the region from which they come, also support for the UN's Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund.
Jim Shannon.
I can thank the Minister very much for that response. Minister, legal immigration is very important. People have the opportunity if they've been persecuted or human rights issues, but the economic migrants have to be stopped where their countries are. France also has a very clear part to play, and sometimes we feel that maybe that hasn't been done in the strong way that it should. Has the Minister had an opportunity to speak to your French counterpart to ensure that they play their part in stopping the economic migrants coming across the Channel?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his important question. And this new government has been determined to strengthen our relationships with all of our partners, including France, on these questions. And my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, of course, has viewed this as a priority from day one. And she's been determined to ensure that we have both the right legal framework, but also the right logistical measures as well here. And then, of course, as I said, we need to be tackling the reasons why people cannot have that livelihood in their own countries, and we're doing a huge amount within the Foreign and Development Office to ensure that we're delivering on that.
Zoe Franklin.
Question 8.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable lady for her question. DCMS ministers are, of course, responsible for government policy on touring artists with support from colleagues across government. The government provides support for artists via the Music Export Growth Scheme, which is funded by DBT and DCMS, and the International Showcase Fund, funded by DBT. And we're engaging with the EU and member states to explore how best to improve arrangements for touring in Europe without a return to free movement.
Zoe Franklin.
Young emerging artists, the very future of our multi-billion-pound music industry, are the worst impacted by the bureaucracy we now have. Will the Minister reconsider negotiating a European-wide exemption from visas, work permits and trucking restrictions to set UK artists free from frustrating red tape?
Yeah. Well, she raises very important issues, Mr. Speaker, and we recognise the challenges she sets out faced by the sector. We have committed to helping our touring artists without seeking a return to freedom of movement. I'm going to work closely with my colleagues, the Minister for the Cabinet Office and DCMS and others on these issues, and we are committed to seeking allowances for cabotage, carnets and customs rules for music, performing arts and culture touring, but it is too early at this stage to discuss details in greater detail.
Rocker.
Question number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his question. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, met with the President of the European Commission on the 2nd of October and agreed to strengthen our relationship between the EU and UK and to hold regular UK and EU summits. The Foreign Secretary attended the EU's Foreign Affairs Council on the 14th of October in Luxembourg, where he and the High Representative agreed to advance discussions towards a new UK-EU security partnership. And I have had many meetings, both bilaterally and indeed as part of processes alongside EU colleagues on issues from Moldova to the Western Balkans in recent weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's attendance at the EU Foreign Affairs Council? And can I ask the Minister to confirm if this will be part of a more regular, structured engagement with our European colleagues?
Absolutely can confirm, Mr. Speaker, that that's the case. We're committed to resetting our relationship and we're committed to delivering outcomes in practice. And I mentioned that I myself attended the Moldova Partnership Platform in Chisinau earlier last month. Particularly important that we work alongside our EU partners when it comes to the attacks on Moldova's democratic future by Putin's Russia. And indeed, important discussions we had on Western Balkans in Berlin last week. I was there with the President of the European Commission and Chancellor Scholz. It's absolutely important that we work together on these critical challenges.
Julian Lewis.
Whilst we hope it never happens, if there were to be a future American president that wished to withdraw support from Ukraine, can the government assure us that in its conversations with EU leaders, this would be a very prominent item on the agenda?
Very good.
Well, obviously, decisions in America are for the American people. The special relationship endures regardless of who is in the White House or what administration, and it's deep and enduring, as he well knows from his important former roles. But absolutely, we need to be cooperating with our EU partners on support for Ukraine. That's exactly why today it's so fantastic to hear the news that we have agreed, as promised, with the G7, with our EU partners, the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Scheme, which will deliver new money to Ukraine now with our European and indeed our American partners.
Bobby Dean.
Question 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as a matter of long-standing policy, which the honourable member will understand, the government doesn't comment on the detail of national security matters, but let me be clear, any attempt by any foreign power to threaten or undermine the UK's democracy will not be tolerated. The National Security Act 2023 brings together vital new measures to protect our national security, which we are committed to as a new government, and I regularly meet my ministerial colleagues, including the Security Minister, to discuss these matters.
Bobby Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of Hong Kongers have made my local community their home under the B&O scheme. However, too many of them are still facing the threat of surveillance, harassment and intimidation by the Chinese state. So can the government confirm that they have raised this issue of transnational repression in their conversations with the Chinese government and made clear that it's a totally unacceptable interference in British democracy?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government will take a consistent long-term and strategic approach to our relations with China, rooted in the UK and global interests, and indeed the government is deeply committed to supporting all members of the Hong Kong community who have relocated to the UK. And I would just reiterate again that any attempts by foreign governments to coerce, intimidate or harm critics overseas are unacceptable, and regardless of nationality, freedom of speech and other fundamental rights of all people in the UK are protected under our domestic law.
My constituency is also home to a new and growing population of Hong Kongers who, although they now live in a free country, live in fear of the repression that the honourable gentleman there described, not least because of the reported presence until recently of a secret police station in Glasgow run by the Chinese Communist Party. Will you join with me in sending a really clear signal to the Chinese state? Hands off Hong Kong Scots.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've made clear our support to the Hong Kong community in the UK, and we have made absolutely clear to Chinese authorities that the existence of undeclared sites in the UK were unacceptable and their operation must cease. And we have been told that they have now closed. The Foreign Secretary has been in China on the 18th and 19th of October, where he met his counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and other senior Chinese figures, and he raised human rights, including issues related to Hong Kong.
Shadow Minister Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Freedom of speech is fundamental to democracy, and yet Jimmy Lai's sham trial is due to resume on the 20th of November. The Foreign Secretary has so far failed to meet Jimmy's family, nor Jagta Singh Johals, who he promised me at the last Foreign Office orals he would meet with within weeks. I wrote 5 weeks ago to Minister about Ryan Cornelius, Ala Abdel Fattah, who should both be free by now, and have received no response from the department at all. So when will the government bring forward its promised special envoy for arbitrary detention, come back to shadow foreign ministers and get our people home?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the case of Jimmy Lai, we call on the Hong Kong authorities to end their politically motivated prosecution and immediately release British national Jimmy Lai, and his case remains a very high priority for His Majesty's government, and UK diplomats attend his court hearing in Hong Kong, and the Foreign Secretary most recently raised the case with Wang Yi during his visit to Beijing on the 18th of October. In relation to Jagtar Singh Johal, on the 24th of July, the Foreign Secretary raised his case with the Indian Minister of External Affairs. I'm very happy to write to her further about these matters, but she can be absolutely assured that we take these cases incredibly seriously.
Alex Bellinger.
11, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 11 and 15 together. The UK was the first G7 country to call for an immediate ceasefire between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel. We did so on the 19th of September. A political solution consistent with Resolution 1701 is the only way to restore security and stability for the people living on both sides of the Blue Line. We continue to press for this with vigour, with urgency, with our international counterparts. The Foreign Secretary did so last week. I did so last week, and we will continue to do so this week and indeed every other day.
Alex Bollinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're all appalled at the increase in violence after Israel's ground invasion of Lebanon. As someone who used to work in Beirut when the country welcomed the million Syrian refugees, it is really upsetting to see people on the move again after so much violence. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his diplomatic efforts so far. Does the Minister agree with me that there is no military solution to the conflict in Lebanon? And will he outline again in more detail what diplomatic efforts he is making to ensure we have a ceasefire so Lebanese and Israeli civilians can return to their homes?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. We agree very much. Only a political solution will enable both Lebanese civilians to return to their home, but also Israeli civilians in the north of Israel. Clearly, Hezbollah have been conducting terrible attacks on northern Israel for a very long period of time, from the 8th of October, a terrible date to have chosen to start. We are working with all of our allies on a plan based around 1701. We talk regularly with all of the key players in the region, and in particular with Amos Hochstein, the US envoy, working on a proposal in order to achieve the effect of 1701, and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reported attacks on UNIFIL bases by the IDF show disregard for Resolution 1701 and the existing diplomatic framework for peace. Last week's joint statement by foreign ministers and our allies condemning all threats to UNIFIL's security was welcomed. So could the foreign minister tell the House what discussions he's had with Israeli political leaders to supplement this action, and if they were productive?
Good question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the important question. We are absolutely clear. Attacks by the IDF on UNIFIL bases must stop, and they must stop immediately. We have called on Israel to that effect. We have called on all parties to uphold their obligations, ensuring the safety and security of UNIFIL personnel, and I'm sure many in this House will be looking at the reports from UNIFIL each day on the situation there. As I said in the answer to the previous question, it is only a political solution consistent with Security Council Resolution 1701 that can restore stability and security. We continue to raise these matters with the Israelis at every level, and I will continue to do so this week.
Also, Andrew Merson.
UNIFIL and UN Security Resolution 1701 plainly have not prevented the construction of tunnels and forward attack positions by Iranian proxies south of the Litani River. What discussions will his right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, be having with the United Nations to ensure that something is put in place to replace 1701, strengthen the role of UNIFIL, and prevent aggressive action by Hezbollah and its fellow travellers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my honourable friend for the question. The first thing we have to do is get Hezbollah back north of the Litani River, consistent with 1701. We should not move away from 1701 until we have made progress underneath it. So I recognise the force of what the honourable friend says about the concerns about Hezbollah's presence close to the Israeli border in breach of UN Security Council resolutions, and I condemn the attacks, as I say, the missile strikes that have been happening since the 8th of October, and indeed all of the other violence that Lebanese Hezbollah has been responsible for. They are prescribed under UK law, and we hold no truck with them, but the way to get them away from the border is 1701, and that's what we've got to stick to.
Monica Harding.
Mr. Speaker, Finn Pugh, who is 8 years old and one of my constituents, wrote to me, "Lebanon," he said, "is a wonderful place. It does not deserve this. I would like the government to protect the people of Lebanon and give them supplies like food and water. What reassurances can the Minister give Finn?"
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Finn, for the question. Since over the course of the last few weeks, we've announced £15 million of aid to people affected by the strikes in Lebanon, and indeed those who are now crossing towards Syria, which is a concerning development in the conflict. Finn is absolutely right to have the people of Lebanon in his mind, and we're doing all we can to try and make sure that the humanitarian system in Lebanon is able to support the people that Finn is concerned by.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The new government's call for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon and in Gaza is, of course, greatly welcomed. However, today is a day when we hear that one of UNIFIL's watchtowers was bombed by the Israeli Defence Forces. First of all, was that one of the watchtowers that we've given them? And secondly, what conversations has he had with his colleagues about beefing up our support of UNIFIL and taking our troop numbers up from 1.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable friend for her question. I'll have to write to her about the specifics of which watchtower it was and whether we've provided any aid. Underlying my honourable friend's question, I think, is a question about what do we do when our statements about UNIFIL are not abided by. And I want to be clear with the House, the current situation is unsustainable. We continue to raise this through all measures diplomatically in order to try and see progress, and we will continue to do so until there is progress. And I can perhaps write about our future plans about peacekeepers in Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is only one route to sustained peace in Lebanon, and that is for the UN and the Lebanese state to stop Hezbollah carrying out its operations. That's right, isn't it?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. We agree that Lebanese Hezbollah should not be conducting the actions that they have been conducting. The way, as I said in response to the previous question, the way to try and resolve this situation needs to be in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions. But if you are asking me, do we think what Lebanese Hezbollah is doing across the blue line is correct or justifiable? It is not. We call on them. We have always called on them to stop. We have prescribed them domestically. We have absolutely no truck with this organisation whatsoever. And Iran's malign influence in Lebanon must stop, and we're taking actions to try and affect that.
Come to Topicals, Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Question number 1, please.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 4 months, we have been reconnecting Britain for our security and prosperity. Last week, I set out my vision for modernising international development, and as I speak, the Foreign Secretary is in Samoa. He is meeting fellow heads of government from the Commonwealth, as is engaged with countries from every continent.
Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Mr. Speaker, the BBC World Service is vital UK soft power. The contribution from the Foreign Office to the funding of this is about £100 million per year, about the cost of an F-35 fighter jet. UK has plans to acquire 74 of these fighter jets. Would the Minister agree with me that we might consider acquiring only 73 of these jets if this was the price of preserving the BBC World Service?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A very fine question from my honourable friend. The BBC World Service is a UK soft power asset. It's 104 million that we give in.
Order. He's answering this question to this minister. Please. I'm going to say to which we really do need to start, Minister.
It's 104 million that we provide to the BBC World Service. It is very good value indeed. I will not seek to get into budget negotiations in advance of the budget because I know better than that, but I agree very much on the importance of the World Service and the vital function it provides internationally.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recent events in Moldova are yet another example of the importance of combating the modern scourge of weaponising disinformation. What new measures are the government planning to implement to counter disinformation spread by our adversaries?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Shadow Foreign Secretary for raising such an important issue. We are launching a new global programme to support resilient, free, open and trustworthy independent media as a bulwark against disinformation. That builds on the success of previous media development programmes, and we're determined to work with partners, including, for example, UNESCO and other international partners, to make sure we play a role on combating disinformation.
Mitchell.
I thank the Minister for that answer. And further to the comment from her honourable friend, the member for Bury St Edmunds, does she share my dismay that while the Director General of the BBC professes the BBC represents a key source of democratic soft power in the face of the spread of state and non-state disinformation, they are now intending to cancel their internationally admired interview programme Hard Talk, which has a global reputation for holding those in power to account?
I'm very grateful for that question. Of course, any editorial decisions on BBC content will be ones made by the BBC alone. That's quite right and proper. But all I can say, Mr. Speaker, is wherever I have been in the world, it is very clear quite how powerful the BBC is. A soft power, perhaps, but a very important reflection of our values as a country of connection, deep connections between the people of Britain and other nations. And we're determined to ensure that that remains the case.
David Taylor.
Mr. Speaker, while we await the outcome of the Foreign Secretary's reviews, our Chancellor's forthcoming budget, and remain confident in the Home Office plans will be successful in reducing domestic refugee costs, this issue remains of concern across our House. Would the Minister be able to offer reassurances today that she will do everything she can to protect these aspects of our foreign aid budget? And would she meet with me and concerned colleagues to discuss how we can take this forward after the Chancellor's budget?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and of course I would be very happy to meet with him and indeed other members of this House, particularly on this side of the House where we have a very considerable number of MPs now who have direct experience of international development work. Of course, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is committed to bringing order to the asylum system. She's taken steps to unblock the backlog of claims, and the fact we lacked a plan to do that previously led to a spiralling of these costs, which really hit the international development budget very hard.
We're going to have to get together. No, you'll hear me out. I've got to get through this list. You're not helping me. You're taking far too long. I've got to get these backbenchers. It matters to them. It matters to their constituency. You've got to work with me, and today it's been a pretty awful day all round. Let's have a Lib Dem spokesperson who's going to give us a good example. Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Laila Suif is in the gallery with us today. She's currently on hunger strike in protest at the continued imprisonment of her son, the British-Egyptian citizen Alaa Abd al-Fattah, who's in prison in Egypt despite the end of his 5-year sentence on the 29th of September. In 2022, the then Shadow Foreign Secretary talked about serious diplomatic consequences for Egypt failing to release Alaa. He spoke of leveraging our trading partnership with Egypt to progress the case. So does the Minister agree with the now Foreign Secretary on these points, and will the government be taking steps?
Another bad example. Somebody wants to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome her to the House. I saw her in Cairo last week and raised these issues with the Egyptian Foreign Minister. Alaa's case is very much in our mind, and we will be doing absolutely everything we can to secure his release as quickly as we possibly can.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2020, the US committed $250 million to support peace building and Palestinian economic development. Will the Minister consider how we can work with our partners in the US to bring our world-leading development expertise and experience in conflict resolution in Northern Ireland to take a lead in this vital work?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an important question. Peace building at a civil society level has a very important role to play in trying to resolve this conflict, and I'll write to the member with details of our plans.
A chance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome this government's ambition in seeking a new climate finance goal at COP29 in Baku shortly. Can the Minister assure me that she understands the scale of need? UNEP says 10 to 18 times more funding for adaptation that's currently on the table, and that she will make sure that it includes loss and damage and is additional to aid?
Very grateful to the Honourable Lady for a very important question. The UK Government could not have been clearer about the fact that climate and nature must be at the heart of all that we do on foreign policy, development policy as well. The Foreign Secretary underlined that at Kew, and I underlined that at the Chatham House speech that I gave last week.
Can I say, those who are on the list do not need to stand. It is more confusing. Fabian Hamilton.
Mr. Speaker, it's estimated that over 42 million tonnes of rubble could be contaminated by unexploded bombs and ordnance in Gaza. It's clearly vital that such a serious threat to human life is dealt with effectively in order to ensure Gaza's post-conflict reconstruction. So will the Minister commit to redoubling our country's support for the work of organisations like the Halo Trust?
The amount of unexploded remnants of war throughout Gaza poses a serious threat to life and to the provision of humanitarian assistance. The UK is working proactively with a number of key stakeholders. We very much recognise the expertise of the Halo Trust in that, and we will indeed be redoubling that work, particularly towards reconstruction.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Hezbollah continues to use Lebanese civilians as human shields, and on Friday the caretaker Prime Minister there accused Iran of blatant interference in Lebanese affairs. What more will the Minister do to help ensure that both Israel and Lebanese counterparts can face down the threat from Iran?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I referred to our actions against Iran in the region and the importance of removing their influence in Lebanon as best we can, and I'll be attending the Lebanon conference in Paris this week where these matters will be discussed.
Adam Thompson.
Speaker, further to the question across the way on climate change, could the Minister address what steps she is taking to support climate change development internationally?
My honourable friend raises an incredibly important point. It's critical that the UK can speak with credibility on these issues. Now, with the new UK government, we can, given the creation of GB Energy and the other measures that we've taken. We're ensuring that climate leadership is always to the fore, and that includes in the COPs. And of course, that for nature in Colombia is fast approaching.
Tom Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Winter is now approaching the Northern Hemisphere, with many civilians in Palestine and Lebanon without homes, water and electricity. What is the government doing to support winterisation efforts in the region?
The honourable gentleman raises an incredibly important question. Of course, we see many people who've been displaced with very few clothes, very few belongings that they desperately need, and particularly with the threat of winter and much worse weather coming very speedily down the track. The government has been discussing this with many of our partners.
Steve Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What update can the Minister give us on UK support for the International Fund for Israeli-Palestinian Peace? And will the government convene a summit of international partners to ensure civil society is at the heart of peace building in the coming years in the region?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer the member to my previous answer, and I'll write to him as well with further details on what we will be doing.
David Mundell.
We're experiencing a global hunger crisis exacerbated by ongoing conflicts and climate change. That makes the forthcoming Paris Nutrition for Growth conference even more important. What preparations are the government making to make an effective contribution to that summit?
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to be raising this point. We are preparing at pace for that Paris conference. It's incredibly important. We need to do all that we can to secure access to the food that's required. It must be nutritious, healthy food. In addition to that, I want to inform him that the UK is preparing to sign up to the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty that I committed the UK to in Brazil just a few weeks ago.
James Nish.
I've previously lived and worked in the Western Balkans, where I know governments continue to increase efforts to tackle human trafficking, exploitation and coercion. What steps are proactively being taken with Albania and other Western Balkan and Mediterranean countries to tackle human trafficking at source?
Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to working more closely with partners across Europe, including Albania and across the Western Balkans, to tackle people trafficking and the gangs profiting from it. It's been a regular part of my bilateral discussions, and in July we announced steps to reinforce our cooperation with Europol, and we've committed £4 million to the Rome process, an Italian government project to tackle the root causes of irregular migration.
Richard Ford.
Speaker, what discussions have ministers had with their Israeli counterparts about the application of distinction and proportionality in international humanitarian law?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has set out our views on the Israeli application of international humanitarian law at greatest length in relation to the decision to suspend arms licences. We keep those issues under regular review, and we'll update the House if there's a change in that assessment.
Imran Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, as we've heard again today in this chamber, war crimes in Gaza continue, making it clear that the time for empty promises and hollow words is over. Does the Minister therefore agree with me that the international community must finally fulfil its responsibility and take real action, starting with immediate sanctions on hard-right extreme ministers in the Netanyahu government?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my honourable friend for the question. I hope that members can see that the words we have been speaking at this dispatch box have not been hollow. Since coming into government, we have restored funding to UNRWA. We have taken steps in the ICC, in the ICJ, and in relation to the arms suspension that I just referred to. In relation to the far-right settlers, which I think the member was referring to, we put in place sanctions just Thursday last week. And as the Prime Minister was clear at Prime Minister's questions, we continue to review these issues and will return to the House.
Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The outgoing US President has indicated he's been told where and when the Israeli government will respond to the Iranian terror threat. Has our government been informed?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think you and other members will understand it's not appropriate to comment in this House.
That's sharp.
The Minister will be aware the ICJ ruled that Member States like the UK are obliged to distinguish in their dealings between the Green Line Israel and occupied territory. In line with that ruling, as well as obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 2334, what steps is the Government taking to address products entering the UK from illegal settlements?
Will Foster. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister is aware.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the complex issues of trade with Israel and how we distinguish, I'll write to the member if that's okay to set this out.
Will Foster. Second.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister is aware of the tragic case of Sarah Sharif in my constituency in Woking. What they might not be aware is when Sarah's family fled Woking to Pakistan, they took Sarah's two siblings with them. They did not return, those siblings did not return when the parents returned to stand trial. Will he agree to write and raise with the Pakistani government that they either vouch for the siblings' safety or that those children should be returned to the UK?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to assure the House that the safety and well-being of British children overseas, which appears to be the situation in this case, is of utmost concern to the whole government and me as the Minister for Consular Affairs. I'll write and meet with the member if that's useful to understand the case and what we can best do to support these children.
That Committee of International Development, Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Even before the current conflict started in Gaza, 98,000 children had a disability. Thousands more have now been horrifically injured, and those with long-term conditions have not had medical support at all. So whilst I welcome the government's commitment to urgently facilitate medical evacuations, how is that possible when Israel is controlling the Rafah crossing?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this issue, and of course it's a matter that she knows in great detail through her work in the Select Committee. Of course, we're determined to ensure that we do all that we can as the UK in partnership with other countries towards the wellbeing and safety of children in Gaza. She mentioned around healthcare, where we have been supporting UK Med and others on that issue, but also around education as well. Many children have now been out of school for a year. We're determined to play our part in rectifying that situation.
Final question, Sarah Green.
Update the House on the grim situation in Sudan. In particular, what pressure is being put on regional actors to stop fuelling the crisis, and what is the UK doing to help the 16 million children that Save the Children estimate face severe food shortage right now?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this situation, because the humanitarian crisis in Sudan is the worst in the world. We see millions of people facing food insecurity, famine, which has been now verified as taking place disturbingly in the Zamzam refugee camp. The UK will continue to do all that we can, including as a penholder, working with partners to raise the profile of this, to say to the warring parties they must allow access to aid. Thank you.
Right, that completes questions. Let the front benches change over. Right, we come to the first statement from the Secretary of State for Defence, John Healey.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on Ukraine, and I apologise for the delay in getting you and the front bench a copy of my statement. The responsibility is entirely mine. Mr. Speaker, I've just returned from 3 days of intense defence diplomacy. First, at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting in Brussels, where we welcomed President Zelensky, and then at the G7 defence ministers in Naples, where we had important updates from the battlefield, agreed this is a critical point in the conflict, and stressed the need to step up and speed up support for Ukraine. The G7 joint declaration strongly condemned Putin's illegal invasion and reinforced our unwavering support for Ukraine. It also rightly stated, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is posing a threat to international security, the purposes and principles of the United Nations, and the rules-based international order. This is what's at stake for us all. And if President Putin prevails in Ukraine, he will not stop at Ukraine. And if big nations redraw international boundaries by force, the sovereignty and security of all nations is undermined. That's why the UK support alongside allies is so important. Military, economic, industrial, diplomatic. But I can tell the House, Mr. Speaker, I've returned to the UK knowing that NATO is united for Ukraine, the G7 is united for Ukraine, just as the UK is united for Ukraine. And our job now is to turn these talks into action, which is exactly what we are doing as a government. So the Chancellor and I today are announcing that the UK will provide an additional £2.26 billion to Ukraine. Now this is new money which will be delivered under the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans to Ukraine scheme. That's part of the $50 billion loan package from G7 countries to support Ukraine's military, budget and reconstruction needs. Loans, Mr. Speaker, which will be repaid using the profits generated from immobilised Russian sovereign assets. Yeah. Profits on frozen Russian money supporting Ukraine's fight against Putin, turning the proceeds of Putin's corrupt regime against that regime and putting it in the hands of Ukrainians. Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. Today's new money is additional to the £3 billion a year of military support this government has committed to Ukraine each year for as long as it takes. In addition to the £3.5 billion Defence Industrial Support Treaty, which I signed with Defence Minister Umerov in July, money that will be used by Ukraine to procure military equipment from British companies, boosting our British jobs and our British industry. And extra to the additional artillery, air defences, ammunition, missiles that we have announced and delivered in the first 4 months of this new government. Ukraine is a first-order priority for me as Defence Secretary. It's a first-order priority for this government. We will continue to step up support, we will continue to lead, and we'll continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Yeah. Now, Mr. Speaker, today is now day 973 since Putin launched his full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. 973 days during which Ukrainians have been fighting with great courage, civilians and military alike. And there have been important battlefield developments in recent weeks. When I last updated the House, Ukrainian forces were 1 month into their remarkable offensive in Kursk. 3 months on, they continue to hold Russian territory, and Ukraine's strategic surprise has put Putin under pressure, forcing the diversion of some Russian troops and equipment. And despite the increase in brutal Russian counterattacks and aerial bombardments, they've so far failed to dislodge that Ukrainian incursion. And it's not just in Kursk where Ukraine is fighting back. Ukrainian forces have launched long-range attacks into Russian territory on military targets which are directly supporting Putin's illegal invasion. In September, Ukraine used long-range drones to attack 4 ammunition storage facilities, strikes which successfully destroyed thousands of tons of ammunition. And both the defensive thrust into Kursk and the strategic defensive strikes into Russia have had an impact on the battlefield. Russia's advance towards Pokrovsk in the east Putin's main line of effort has been slowed. Russian losses continue to rise. Since the start of the conflict, Russia has likely suffered 675,000 casualties. And in September, the average casualty rate each day of Russians on the battlefield in Ukraine was 1,271, a record high, 2.5 times the rate of this time last year. And on equipment, Mr. Speaker, they've now lost 3,400 tanks, 8,500 armoured vehicles, and 26 vessels in the Black Sea Fleet have been destroyed or damaged. But despite this incredible Ukrainian resilience, they remain under great pressure from Russian forces across multiple fronts. And Russian troops continue to advance and continue to attack Ukrainian infrastructure, targeting the important port of Odessa and striking energy infrastructure. So as we head into winter, Mr. Speaker, Ukraine's energy generation capacity has been reduced by up to 2/3 of that of pre-war levels. Russian industry remains on a war footing. Russian artillery is outfiring Ukraine at least 3-1. And Russia is also recruiting this year an additional 400,000 troops. Defence will account for 32%, 1/3 of the total government budget in Russia next year. And Mr. Speaker, in a concerning new development, it is now highly likely that the transfer of hundreds of combat troops from North Korea to Russia has begun. North Korean soldiers supporting Russia's war of aggression on European soil. It is as shocking as it is desperate. North Korea already sends significant munitions and arms to Russia in direct violation of multiple UN resolutions. And this developing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK has serious security implications for Europe and for the Indo-Pacific. It represents a wider growing alliance of aggression which NATO and the G7 nations must confront. Mr. Speaker, despite this dangerous development, Ukraine remains determined to fight on their front line in the east and in the territory in Kursk. President Zelensky will continue to seek support for his victory plan, and we want to see this plan succeed. We stand ready to work closely with the Ukrainians and with allies to help it succeed. And as we approach 1,000 days of this war, this conflict is now at a really critical moment. And that's why the UK continues to step up support for Ukraine. Ukrainians are fighting to regain their sovereign territory, but they are also fighting to protect the peace, the democracy and the security for the rest of us in Europe.
James Cartledge, the Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I start by thanking Secretary of State for advance side of his statement. May I offer my condolences and everyone on this side of the House to the family and friends of Corporal Christopher Gill, who we understand tragically lost his life during a training exercise recently. We understand he served this country for 13 years, including in Afghanistan, and more recently volunteered to train Ukrainian soldiers in the UK, having visited Salisbury Plain last May to see Operation Interflex, Mr. Speaker. We should be grateful to all of our service personnel, including Corporal Gill, who've played such a huge role training the Ukrainian armed forces. So they continue to fight and defend their homeland, a fight that goes on and one to which we continue to offer all support to the government, including in standing by the government, people and armed forces of Ukraine. As such, we warmly welcome the G7 joint declaration and funding announcement, but particularly share the government's concerns in relation to North Korea. Mr. Speaker, I have lost count of the many times Vladimir Putin has accused us and our allies of so-called escalatory action in our support for Ukraine. But today, we are considering the very real threat of North Korean combat troops being sent to support Russia's illegal invasion. Let us be in no doubt. Any potential agreement between Putin and Kim Jong-un to have North Korean boots on the ground in Ukraine at all, let alone in the numbers that have been reported, would be a major escalatory ratchet by Putin himself. After all, as the Secretary of State confirmed, Russia has already procured munitions and ballistic missiles from North Korea. Not only was the transfer of those weapons in the first place completely unacceptable, but a blatant violation of UN sanctions that Russia itself voted for. Both the transfer of North Korean weapons and now the threat of combat troops belies weakness and desperation, as the Secretary of State said, not strength on Putin's part. And above all, it begs the question of what he is offering North Korea in return. But we should not be deterred and must respond. We took decisive countermeasures to help constrain the transfer of weapons between North Korea and Russia. The Conservative government imposed sanctions on the arms for oil trade between Russia and North Korea, including asset freezes, travel bans and transport sanctions, and the new government in turn must now respond to this latest threat of combat troops. Can I press the Minister to look at how the UK should respond in the round? Yes, we need to look at the diplomatic tools we can use to disrupt cooperation between North Korea and Russia. But we also need to urgently look again both at our military aid to Ukraine and the freedom we offer them in terms of using the munitions we supply, particularly long-range missiles, Mr. Speaker. As such, and given the continued need to keep providing further capability to Ukraine, we welcome yesterday's announcement that the UK will contribute £2.6 billion to the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan Scheme. We were a vocal advocate for mobilising frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine and strongly welcome the additional funding. Can I ask him, when will the money be made available to Ukraine and over what term? The sooner these funds are mobilised, the better. So when exactly will Ukraine receive the funding? Finally, Mr. Speaker, we have spoken many times of the reality that we are not just facing Russian aggression, but a broader authoritarian axis that ultimately threatens the UK. We've seen this explicitly in terms of Iran and the Red Sea, and now we see it coming ever closer to home with the prospect of North Korean troops deploying in a European theatre of war. Surely this strengthens even further the argument that the government needs to deliver on its supposed cast iron guarantee to spend 2.5% on defence. So given that the Secretary of State failed to answer me in defence orals, can I once again press him to confirm that he is fighting hard with the Treasury to deliver a clear pathway to 2.5% in the budget at the end of this month?
Secretary of State. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for his comments about Corporate Gill, and I will pass those on to his widow and make sure his family is aware of that and the sentiments of the whole House. He's right about the enormous contribution that Corporal Gill made, including to the Interflex training programme, and that's a programme I was proud to be able to commit to extending throughout 2025. It's a programme that the Chancellor and I together visited on Sunday, where we met Colonel Boardman, the commander of Operation Interflex, and we met the officers and soldiers, Mr. Speaker, of the Three Scots, together with instructors from Kosovo, Australia and Sweden, illustrating the way that the UK is leading a multinational effort to support Ukrainian soldiers. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right, and I suspect there is unanimity in this House of concern about the developments in Russia and the growing alliance with North Korea, united in its determination to take the action required to respond to that, and united in recognising that we must do so alongside NATO and other G7 allies. He asks me about the new funds, the loan funds available for Ukraine through the proceeds of the interest on frozen Russian assets. We expect those to be available and in the Ukraine hands from early in the new year, which will make the UK ahead of many other nations participating in this scheme in doing so. And finally, Mr. Speaker, on 2.5%, we remain totally committed to spending 2.5% on defence. We must do this to meet the threats this country faces. The Prime Minister confirmed that commitment to set out a clear path to 2.5% in our first week in government at the NATO summit in Washington. And I just say to him gently again, the last time this country spent 2.5% on defence was in 2010 with a Labour government, a level that has never been matched in any of the 14 Conservative years since.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tamlanji Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the announcement today of the UK's increased support for funding for Ukraine as part of the ERA loan scheme, and the Secretary of State spoke about what is at stake for us all, but can he speak more about what discussions he had with his counterparts at the NATO defence ministers meeting about the need for them to substantially increase their support, and further to our Prime Minister's recent meeting with the US President, what update is there on the usage of Storm Shadow missiles by Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, can I first welcome the new chair of the Select Committee, who I believe now has a committee to chair, and I look forward to an invitation, I hope, to give evidence and to discuss with them soon. Mr. Speaker, at the NATO defence ministers, there was unanimity amongst 32 nations that the important commitments that NATO nations made in Washington, particularly to the $40 billion of extra support for Ukraine, must be delivered. There was a recognition too that pledges made must be pledges delivered. And one of the striking concerns that the Ukrainians have is that a third of the equipment and support pledged has so far been delivered. So there was a determination to step up, not just what we can provide, but how quickly we can provide it, something that as a new government we did from day one. And Mr. Speaker, on Storm Shadow, only Putin benefits from a discussion about this. There is no single weapon that has turned the tide of any war, and whether it is artillery, ammunition, armoured vehicles or missiles, the UK provides support to Ukraine to pursue its UN right to defend its territory and its people.
We come to Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. Liberal Democrats welcome the new measures announced today to use the profits of frozen assets for Ukraine. That $2 billion will be of immense value to our Ukrainian allies as they seek to repel Putin's illegal invasion. Not least following the alarming news that 1,500 North Korean troops are currently being trained in Russia to fight in Ukraine. But we must go further, faster. Russia must not and cannot succeed. There remains $22 billion of frozen assets locked up in our country. We urge the government, as we have done for years, to seize these assets and repurpose them for Ukraine right away. Will the Minister commit to doing so? Is he having conversations with our democratic partners to this effect? And with the US elections fast approaching, it's deeply worrying that our commitment to our Ukrainian allies is uncertain. A second Trump presidency could have a devastating effect on the security of Europe and of Ukraine. So we urge the government, seize these assets now so that we can support Ukraine come what may. We must lead with Europe on this. EU countries have between them close to $20 billion worth of frozen assets. Will the Minister consider convening an urgent summit with European counterparts to begin that process? And does he agree that if the US cannot, then Europe must?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say to the honourable gentleman, lady, that in fairness to the party opposite, when they were in government, and her party before the election, as we did, we were united in the efforts to try and get the interest drawn down from the frozen Russian assets put in Ukrainian hands. And the UK government, before the last election and since, has been leading this work. This is practical steps we can take now. Whatever the declaratory position she wants to adopt about seizing Russian assets, this is valuable additional funding that from the new year will be in the hands of the Ukrainian government to be able to spend, in the UK's case, on the military aid that they need. This is in addition to all the other increase that we've put in place since the election. And just say to her, I hope, despite her calls for going very much further, she'll recognise how significant this move is. She'll recognise that the UK is amongst the first of the nations to move on this, and that she will give this House the full support when we introduce the primary legislation that will seek the Parliamentary Spending Authority to provide this financial assistance in pursuant of a bilateral agreement that we'll strike with Ukraine over how to do it. Thank you.
Emma Lulba. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When this government said our support for Ukraine was absolute, we meant it. My right honourable friend referred to the recently signed Defence Export Treaty between the UK and Ukraine, which will support Ukraine's defence industrial base whilst helping to replenish our own stockpiles. As far as he is able, can he update the House on the treaty's progress?
Seriously. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I was proud to sign that treaty. It is a treaty that means the Ukraine can draw down the export credit cover. It can contract with UK companies. And it's a framework also, Mr. Speaker, like some of the other frameworks the UK has put in place that other nations and the companies of other nations can use in order to deal with the difficulties that many face in contracting with Ukraine. It will be used by the Ukrainians for the contracting and the procurement of munitions, for ammunition. It will allow us not just to step up the provision of military aid support to Ukraine, but the production of essential military aid to Ukraine as well. Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the statement, but the BBC are reporting that the money will be paid not in one go, but in tranches over time. We have the budget next week. Can the Secretary of State absolutely assure us that, as this is what accountants would call an exceptional item, this money will in no way be included in the overall defence budget next week and will in no way be attempted to bolster or bump that up, because there are rumours there will actually be cuts? Can you just give us that assurance this is a one-off and it will be treated completely differently in the Red Book?
Serious State. Mr. Speaker, I can give the Right Honourable Gentleman that assurance. This is a one-off. It is additional. It is separate. It will be accounted for and set out separately in the Treasury documentation. Its significance is that it is a loan to Ukraine that Ukraine will not have to pay back, because it's the interest on the frozen Russian assets that will service that loan. And he asks at the beginning of his question, why not this paid all in one go? This will be made available soon in the new year. The Ukrainians will be able to draw it down as they need it for the purposes that they decide they need it for. Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's comments that he says that in terms of North Korea and the growing alliance of aggression needs to be confronted, and I hope we have a strong response to that. But can I also welcome the 2.2 billion extra? But he makes a very important point during his statement, one of many, which was that the Ukrainians have been outgunned 3-1 in artillery by the Russians. So, of course, while the additional support is vital, how quickly can we ensure we get extra munitions, artillery and missiles from the alliance, from the G7 and that across to Ukraine?
Secretary of State. We can get it into the hands of Ukrainians just as soon as it's available for that purpose. And it's one of the reasons, for instance, when I announced the new contract in the UK to produce the short-range air defence missiles, the LMMs, initial contract of 650. They will be in the hands of Ukrainians from the beginning of next year, and we hope to step that up during the course of 2025. Likewise, where other nations are ready to make available the weaponry and the ammunition that Ukrainians need, the established arrangements for getting it in the hands of Ukrainians is in place. It's not a question of how, it's a question of how quickly. Sir Julian.
The delicious irony of the interest on Kremlin kleptocrats' ill-gotten gains being used to fund the resistance against Russian aggression will not be lost on members in all parts of this House, and I welcome in entirety what the Defence Secretary has said. He will know better than any of us the crucial importance of the NATO alliance machinery in the assistance of Ukrainian resistance. And given that one recent ex-American president and one current French president have both made disobliging remarks about the NATO alliance in the fairly recent past. Can he reassure us that, at least in the case of President Macron, he is now fully on board the alliance and France's important contribution to it?
Mr. Speaker, I can indeed. At no point during the 2 days of NATO defence ministers' talks was there any indication of the sort of views that he suggests may be held by some in America or previously might have been expressed by President Macron. And indeed, in the very good bilateral meeting that I had with the French Defence Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, it is quite clear that the French commitment to support Ukraine is as strong as the UK commitment, and I'm glad to say the determination of the French to work with us more closely on security and defence is also equally strong.
Kelvin Bailey.
I welcome the statement today and the announcement of further funding. And in order to ensure that we sustain the pace and level of support that we're providing aid to the Ukraine, and to ensure that we energise our own logistical enterprise, may I ask my right honourable friend what action he has taken to boost UK defence industrial production to support both Ukrainian armed forces and our own defence supply chains across the whole of the UK?
Well, my honourable friend knows this territory probably as well as anybody else in this House, Mr. Speaker, and he will know that over the 973 days, one of the things that the UK government has done is to change fundamentally the way that we go about procuring what's required. And industry, British industry, has responded magnificently to that, being able to respond quicker, innovate more rapidly, and to devise what they can produce to meet the needs that Ukraine says they have on the front line. Our task in UK government is to be the middleman, if you like, to make sure that that can happen. It can happen at greater volumes and it can happen at greater speed, and we'll continue to do that.
Mike Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the government think that Ukraine is winning or losing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if he was listening to my statement, but I made very clear that this is a critical period in the conflict. Ukraine is under huge pressure, especially on the Eastern Front, but it is fighting, it is counter-offensing, it is putting Putin under pressure as well. And the only conclusion that the 32 nations drew from the discussions in Brussels, the confirmation of the G7 nations in Naples, was that now is the moment where Ukraine's allies must step up the support that we can provide, put Ukraine in the strongest possible position to withstand the Russian onslaught, and to be able to put pressure also on Putin. Military, economic, diplomatic.
Cartettles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the statement today from the Secretary of State. It's really good news for Ukraine. Would he agree with me that Ukraine is the frontier of war with Kremlin, and international support is more critical than ever before, and we must be absolutely clear that the defence of the UK begins in Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is right, and her very words were repeated by a number of defence ministers in Brussels. Defence of the UK starts in Ukraine, defence of Europe starts in Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for the same values, and Ukraine is also fighting for the rest of us in Europe.
Sir Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, in sharp contrast to the presence of the Secretary General of the United Nations at Putin's summit in Russia, which sends out all the wrong signals, the Secretary of State's statement this morning is hugely welcome. Thank you. But in further to the question raised by the Chairman of the Select Committee, is it really not time that not only Storm Shadow, but that all the material being supplied to Ukraine by the Western Alliance should be used by Ukraine in the manner that they most see fit?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, we provide Ukraine with the weaponry and the support to defend its country, to defend its freedom, to defend its people. And there is a consistency in that, and there is no bar in them striking Russian targets, military targets, as long as it's consistent with international humanitarian law and it's part of the defence, the proper defence of their country. And I spoke about the long-range drones and the successful attacks that they have been making. Defensive attacks, but nevertheless on military targets in Russia. It is for the Ukrainians to determine how best to defend their country, and we will support them in whatever ways that we can.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I warmly welcome this £2.26 billion of aid announced today. It's a great news for those fighting for democracy in Europe and a day of low morale in the Kremlin. It's fantastic. Can I ask, and considering that what the Ukrainians might well use some of this money for is to continue innovating at pace, they're creating new technologies to fight against Putin every few weeks at the moment, they're cutting edge, they're adaptive. Can I ask the Secretary of State, are we going to learn from our friends in Ukraine and make sure that we as a country are investing in our own defence SMEs so that we can have the same output in the future? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while there's been no change in the basis on which we provide military aid to Ukraine, there is a change in the approach that we take, not just to providing aid, but to producing some of the military equipment and ammunition. And what our challenge now is to take the lessons of what we've demonstrated can be done to support Ukraine in order to be able to equip our own forces better to fight in the future.
Dave Duggan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, its content and advance sight of it. The additional funding for Ukraine is, of course, very welcome, but it's what material they turn that into which will have the effect on the battlefield that we wish to see. With the shell production of our European partners still well short of 1 million units per year, can the Secretary of State, as far as possible, indicate how UK shell production has grown, either in numeric or percentage terms? And if he can't share that with the House, can he give us an assurance that it is increasing? Thank you.
State. Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely give him the assurance it's increasing. I've already spoken about the short-range air defence missiles, the LMMs, which is increasing, particularly to meet what the Ukrainians need. And they're very clear. It is air defence systems, it's long-range drones, it's the things that matter most, both for their defence and their ability to put Russia properly under pressure as well.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome today's announcement of an additional £2.2 billion financial support for Ukraine generated by frozen Russian assets. Can my right honourable friend say a little more about this concerning development of North Korean soldiers supporting Russia's war of aggression on European soil, and how that underlines the importance of us using every tool in our box to support Ukraine's efforts?
So State. Mr. Speaker, I regret to say to my honourable friend, I'm not in a position to give the House any more details of this. First to say, we are watching this extremely closely, monitoring it extremely closely, but we and the House has detected this growing cooperation between North Korea and Russia, growing cooperation between Iran and Russia, at least over the last 12 months. It's a sign not of strength but of weakness on Putin's part, but it does introduce a dangerous new development, both to Ukraine and to wider European security.
Mark Pritchard.
I welcome the Defence Secretary's recognition of President Zelensky's victory plan and his support for that, but he will know that part of that plan is the use of long-range missiles. And I get his point about long-range drones, UK drones, being used for military targets only in Russia and within the norms of international rules of law. I also detect, perhaps, with two questions on long-range missiles, these edging towards a position where you might publicly declare that Ukraine can have the freedom to hit targets in Russia, military targets, using long-range missiles. That will change the war. That will have an impact.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, we step up the support we provide to Ukraine, but there's been no change in the basis on which we provide that support to Ukraine.
Clive Betts.
Speaker, could I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and also thank him for the amount of personal commitment he's clearly making to this subject. It's obviously very expensive for Putin to fight this war, but he's getting a lot of this money from the sale of oil. There are real concerns that there are British firms or firms with British connections who are facilitating and enabling the illegal oil trade to go on. So what more can be done in cooperation with his friend, the Foreign Secretary, to ensure that sanctions are more effective against the Russian oil trade?
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend is right. It isn't just that we can confirm today making this additional loan money available for the Ukrainians. It's also important to remember that the sanctions themselves are responsible for freezing at least $400 billion of money otherwise that Russia will be able to use to feed its war machine. And wherever there is evidence of sanctions busting, including some of the steps that have been taken by this UK government and others on the shadow fleet, in other words, the shipping that is in the grey zone trying to avoid sanctions. Wherever we have the evidence required to act and to sanction, we will do that and will continue to do that.
Sure, Blatham.
Not only is a full battalion of North Korean soldiers set to be deployed to assist Russia in Ukraine, but Putin is also benefiting from components and weapons provided by the Iranians and the Chinese. This all represents an unprecedented conflation of threats to global security. So I echo the question put by my friend, the Shadow Defence Secretary. The commitment to investing 2.5% of GDP is the right one, but when will it be backed up with action?
Well, the right honourable lady is right. You know, we totally condemn North Korea's involvement and support for Russia, from arms transfer to any further developments. And as I said in my statement, this is in breach of multiple UN resolutions, and we'll continue to watch that.
Phil Bricknell.
Mr. Speaker, will the Secretary of State join me in paying tribute to UK armed forces who are providing vital support to our Ukrainian allies, but also to the Ukrainian armed forces that are fighting valiantly against Putin's unlawful invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah.
I will indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I've had the privilege of visiting Interflex training courses, I think 4 times now. I visited the second ever course at Salisbury Plain. It is deeply moving both to see the level of commitment of British forces to the task of training Ukrainians and to spend time with those Ukrainian recruits, men who are lorry drivers, bank clerks, PR executives of all ages who have volunteered to fight for their country and their freedom, trained by British forces, now with other countries alongside them, equipping them to be able to fight for their country, but knowing that they will return to their own nation, they will return, and they will return soon to the front line, is deeply sobering.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
I very much welcome this £2.26 billion, but has the Defence Secretary had an opportunity to study the National Audit Office report published last month into the impact of our operations in Ukraine, in particular on that Operation Interflex has had on the availability of the defence estate for the training of units of the British Army? And whilst that's acceptable in the short term, in the long term it probably is not. What impact assessment has he carried out, and what proposals does he have to make available the defence estate we need to train British soldiers?
Secretary of State.
Well, nothing will shake our commitment to continuing the Interflex training programme. We've determined, and we will continue that throughout 2025. And those partner countries that have been alongside us this year, many are now already committed to doing so next year. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the forgive me, he asked me about Interflex, and he asked me about the defence estate, and he asked me about the training of Ukrainian soldiers. That will continue. And in terms of the National Audit Office report, which is where he started, I have indeed read that report. It is a welcome change from the normal run that we've been used to in recent years of National Audit Office reports into the Ministry of Defence. And it praises a good deal of what has been done by the Ministry of Defence in support of Ukraine, and it's very welcome.
Graham Downey.
Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State for a very welcome statement indeed. In that statement, he mentioned the importance of Ukrainian forces' efforts in the Black Sea against the Russian Black Sea Fleet and how important that is to the Ukrainian economy. Can he perhaps go a little bit further and describe how this funding with Ukraine will actually help them to ensure that security and perhaps even go further in the Black Sea? Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the principle of this funding is that we put it in the hands of Ukrainians. Ukrainians are in the best position and must be in the position to decide how best to use it. We have said they can use it entirely if they choose for military support, and the support that they choose to procure with it will be a matter for them in discussion with us.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is the Defence Secretary able to share with us any conversations that the Foreign Secretary had whilst in China about China's engagement in this situation, and particularly their willingness to bring the influence that they undoubtedly have on both Russia and North Korea to bear?
Secretary of State.
Happily, I can indeed. Madam Deputy Speaker. So the Foreign Secretary was in China on the 18th and 19th of October. He met with his counterpart, the Foreign Minister, and he did indeed talk about the areas in which our countries may disagree, including on Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and he talked also and raised the UK's concerns over China's supply of equipment to Russia and to Russia's military-industrial complex.
Kevin Benavia.
Deputy Speaker, I also very much welcome today's statement from our right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. It's evidence not just of warm words, but of real practical support for our ally in its desperate hour of need. But this country cannot do this on its own. Can my right honourable friend update this House on any discussions that he or his ministerial colleagues have had with our friends in the rest of the G7 in combating Putin through economic measures?
Secretary of State.
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I came away from Naples from the G7. I came away from Brussels for the NATO defence ministers, reinforced of the view that there is a determination not just to stand with Ukraine now, but to do so for as long as it takes. And I will send my honourable friend a copy of the communiqué from both, in which I think he will be encouraged, as I was, by the degree of unanimity and determination, not to allow Putin to believe that if he holds out, the West will give up.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the announcement of the acceleration loans, but also welcome the timing. The British government is not simply waiting to see the outcome of the US presidential election in the way that some governments are doing at this time. Will the Defence Secretary repeat the assurance that he gave the House last week, namely that European NATO nations can assure Ukraine that, regardless of US policy, military aid to Ukraine will not decrease next year?
Secretary of State.
On the contrary, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're determined to maintain and step up from the UK the military aid required. There is a similar determination I found from defence ministers across the NATO nations, and we recognise that this is a fight the Ukrainians are mounting for themselves, but they are also waging on behalf of us all and the values that we share with them.
Tarfield Crichton.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for this additional 2.26 billion for Ukraine, which will find a strong echo amongst the hundreds and thousands of individuals across this country who've opened their doors to Ukrainian refugees, and the works of charities and organisations like Jeeps for Peace in Scotland, which sends direct aid by taking pickups across Europe to the front line. And doesn't this money and the individual support of Britain show that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful for his thanks. Those thanks should really go to the Chancellor, because it's the Treasury that has led the way on ensuring that we can put in place this new system of loans and make this money additionally available to Ukraine. But he's completely right to say part of the strength of the support that we can offer as a country to Ukraine rests on the strength of the support of the British people, the warmth of which they've shown from the outset for Ukrainian refugees, and also the determination of many groups. He cites one that have been willing to collect and in some cases transport support for Ukraine and Ukrainians out to the country itself, and I pay tribute to their efforts.
Ben Opsijekti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is concerning that we only received the briefest of updates in this House on the direct involvement of North Korean troops after a week of this being widely reported in the media. Last week, during defence questions, the Right Honourable Gentleman gave his full-throated support for Ukraine, but made no mention of the government's awareness of North Korean reinforcements potentially being deployed in up to brigade strength. So what is the government's current assessment of the scope of North Korean involvement, and how do overt North Korean boots on the ground in Ukraine necessitate a change in our posture?
State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've just given the House the assessment of the involvement and the extent at present of North Korean troops.
Blair McDougall.
The North Korean boots potentially joining on the ground, the Iranian drones in the air above Ukraine. It seems clear now that the calculus that Russia is operating to is very different from that of the Western alliance. And I wonder if the Secretary of State agrees with me that there's a risk that when the fear of escalation is one-sided, that itself becomes escalatory. And so while welcoming the additional support that's announced today, I wonder if you'll join me in saying it's time for other countries to follow the lead that the UK has shown today.
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, wherever there is signs of breaching UN resolutions, of breaching sanctions and of dangerous escalation in support of Russia, we will act. We have acted before. And he is right to point to the growing alliance that we see between Russia and Iran and between Russia and North Korea.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank very much the Secretary of State for his statement and indeed for his very, very welcome news. Everybody in this House is pleased and indeed incredibly pleased at the decision by our government and by our Minister to do that. Thank you very much. I'm just a bit conscious of the US elections. I want to ask a question if I can in relation to that. As the US election draws closer and the uncertainty of the level of support that will come from the US post-election, does the Secretary of State agree that there must be caution, I say this very, very respectfully, of any minister or indeed anyone in this House expressing an opinion on that presidential race? But will the Secretary of State take the opportunity to reaffirm the strong, resilient view of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to stand against Russian aggression, to support those who need our help through aid, through weaponry and through diplomacy? Thank you so much.
State.
I think the Honourable Gentleman is right, quite clearly. The US elections are for the US people. As a UK government and as a UK Parliament, we will deal with whoever the American people choose to elect as their president. He is right, however. I'm glad he welcomes the support that as a government we've stepped up for Ukraine. But I'd say to him and to the House and the Honourable Gentleman opposite, who is the Shadow Defence Secretary, well, I think will recognise this. It makes the job of the UK government so much easier to provide this support when there is such united support in this House for what we must do to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Tim Rocker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome the statement today from my right honourable friend. I wouldn't expect him to comment, as he said before, on the US presidential election, but naturally there is a nervousness of policy of a future US government, which makes what European partners and allies do even more important. And there is a huge disparity between the aid being provided by different partners across Europe. Denmark has been phenomenal in providing 1.86% of GDP, or over €6 billion. Other countries, such as Spain, not so much. Can he assure us that there were robust discussions in private amongst his Defence Minister colleagues in Brussels?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I can. There were those discussions, and those discussions were about the level of commitment we must make collectively to Ukraine, and the level of commitment we must make collectively to NATO itself. And I welcome the fact that this year 23 of the 32 NATO nations will meet that 2% of GDP threshold. It has to be a bare minimum. There is more that we will need to do, particularly as European nations within NATO in the years ahead.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I warmly thank the Secretary of State and the full ministerial team for their hard work on mobilising this additional money from frozen Russian sovereign assets, and I do hope other countries will follow UK leadership on this. In mobilising every tool across the government, and with winter approaching, could I also ask the Secretary of State to continue the push to realise the assets from the sale of Chelsea Football Club, the £2.5 billion from Roman Abramovich that could go towards humanitarian needs, which are also increasingly urgent in Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Yes, indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government sees the case that he makes, and my honourable friend, the Foreign Minister, in fact met, I believe, my honourable friend last night to discuss this further.
Gordon McKee.
On a visit to Kyiv with parliamentary colleagues last month, we saw firsthand the incredible bravery of the Ukrainian people, who I know will welcome this afternoon's statement. But unfortunately, Russia's war machine continues to be powered by Western-made semiconductors that are smuggled into the country. So can I ask the Secretary of State what work the government is doing to make sure that Russia does not get access to this technology?
Secretary of State.
One of the great assets of this government is my honourable friend, the Foreign Minister. And he's a great asset to this government and this House because of the work that he does with so many other countries. And wherever there is discussions that are required or evidence that's gathered, my honourable friend is speaking to a lot of the countries who may find that they have within their own country companies that could be involved in those supply chains. Wherever that happens, my honourable friend is on it, and he's leading the charge to make sure that where we can identify those supply chains, we take the action that's necessary to close them down.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his very welcome statement. As we approach 1,000 days since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, it's increasingly clear that Ukraine's survival is dependent on the West increasing our manufacture of munitions. Can you say a little bit more about boosting our defence industrial supply chains, including those in the West Midlands, where defence manufacturers are very keen to contribute?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is right. The importance of the British defence industry isn't just in the greater security that gives us as a nation, it's part of the economic boost that will drive growth in the future. And one of the features I was so pleased to see at the recent Government Investment Summit was the confirmation that defence would be one of the 8 economic growth sectors which would receive the priority policy, focus and support as we develop that for the future. This is in the interests of Ukraine immediately. It's in our own interests in the future. It's the way that we can combine both the strengthening of our national security and the boost to our national economy.
I'll now give the front benches a few moments to change over before we start on the second statement. I call the Lord Chancellor Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With your permission, I would like to make a statement on how this government will address the crisis in our prisons, not just today, but for years to come. This House has heard me recount my inheritance as Lord Chancellor before. The crisis in our prisons was, I believe, the greatest disgrace of the last Conservative government. They left our prisons on the point of collapse, a situation that would have forced us to close the prison doors, cancel all trials, and force the police to halt their arrests. Crime would have gone unpunished, victims would never have seen justice done, and we would have witnessed the total breakdown of law and order. The former Prime Minister knew he had to act. His Lord Chancellor begged him to do so, but instead he called an election. As I announced to this House on the 18th of July, we had no choice but to bring forward the release point for some prisoners. Some of those serving standard determinate sentences have seen the custodial element reduced from 50% to 40%, spending the rest of their sentence on licence, where they can be recalled to prison should probation staff judge that necessary to protect the public. As we saw over the summer of disorder, these releases could not have come soon enough. After the August bank holiday, we were left with fewer than 100 spaces in our men's prisons. The system was only held together by the heroic work and considerable goodwill of our prisons and probation staff. And we were, on many occasions, just one bad day from disaster. Today, the second tranche of emergency releases takes place, creating desperately needed space within our prisons. But this is not the long-term solution. So I will now set out the long-term plan for our prisons, a plan that will ensure that never again is a Lord Chancellor placed in the invidious position that I was on taking office. This must begin by building more prisons. For all their rhetoric, the last Conservative government's record on prison building was abject. They like to mention that between 2010 and 2024, they built 13,000 places. What they are less keen to admit is that in that same time, they closed 12,500. In 14 years, they added just 500 places to our prison capacity. In just our first 100 days, this government is already close to matching that. And while the last government promised to build 20,000 new places by the mid-2020s, by the time they left office, they had built only 6,000. They were simply too terrified of their own backbenchers, who supported prison building vociferously as long as those prisons weren't getting built anywhere near them. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will build the prisons the last Conservative government promised but failed to deliver. But in seeking a lasting solution to our prisons crisis, we must be honest too, in a way that my predecessors were not. We cannot build our way out of this problem. Every year, our prison population grows by around 4,500 prisoners. This is a question of simple mathematics. To build enough prisons to meet this demand, we would have to build the equivalent of HMP Birmingham, in my own constituency of Birmingham Ladywood, 4.5 times over every single year. To put that in some context, in the last 10 years, the last Conservative government built just 3 prisons. So while we will speed up prison building and build as fast as we possibly can, that pace is simply impossible. For that reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we are to address our prisons crisis, we must be smarter about who receives a prison sentence. Now, let me be clear. There will always be a place for prison, and there will always be offenders who must be locked up. But we must also expand the range of punishments that we use outside of prison and consider how we punish those offenders who have broken our rules but are not a danger to society. For that reason, I am today launching a review of sentencing, and it will have one clear goal: to ensure that we are never again in a position where we have more prisoners than we have space in our prisons. The review will follow 3 principles. First, sentences must punish offenders and protect the public. For dangerous offenders, prison will always remain the answer. Punishment and public protection will be this government's first priority. There will also be some offenders who I will task the review with considering, like prolific offenders, who are just 1 in every 10 individuals, but nearly half of all sentences. Some of these are hyper-prolific offenders committing hundreds of crimes, and I will ask the reviewers to consider whether a longer sentence might punish them better and force them to engage with rehabilitation on the inside. The second related principle of the review is that sentences must encourage offenders to turn their backs on crime. We need both sticks and carrots. In this, I will be encouraging the reviewers to learn from others who have succeeded. In Texas, for instance, Republican legislators were faced by a problem similar to ours: a soaring prison population, sky-high reoffending rates, and prisons that had run out of space. Working across political divides, the Texans introduced a system of good behaviour credits, where well-behaved prisoners could earn time off their sentence by engaging in rehabilitation programmes. And the results were remarkable. Crime fell by nearly a third, reaching the lowest levels in half a century. The prison population fell by over 20,000, and after 2 decades, the Texans had closed 16 prisons rather than building new ones. The third principle of the review is that it must expand the punishment that offenders receive outside of prison. There are already ways that we severely constrain offenders, limiting their freedom outside of prison. Those under home detention curfews are, in practice, under a form of house arrest. With a tag on their ankle and a sensor in their home, they are placed under curfews, generally for 12 hours each day. And should they break that curfew, they can be picked up and, if needs be, locked up. In some ways, punishment outside of prison can be even more restrictive than prison. It is a sad fact that in many of our prisons today, a drinker can all too easily procure a drink. On a sobriety tag, however, with their sweat measured every 30 minutes and a 97% compliance rate, their teetotalism is almost as strict as mine. All of this is just using the technology that is immediately available to us and used already in this country. I will be inviting the reviewers to consider the technology that they have available to them now, and also the next frontier of technology used in other countries but not yet in ours. Because I believe that the modern world presents us with the opportunity to build a prison outside of prison, where the eyes of the state follow a prisoner more closely than any prison officer can. Moving punishment out of prison for those who can be safely managed there has huge benefits. Outside of prison, offenders can engage in work that pays back communities and individuals who they have harmed. And the evidence is abundantly clear that those who serve their sentences outside of prison are far less likely to reoffend, cutting crime with fewer victims and safer streets, and reducing the huge cost to society of reoffending, most recently valued at over £22 billion a year. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government believes that crime must have consequences and criminals must be punished. It also believes in rehabilitation, that those who earn the right must be encouraged to turn their backs on crime. This government believes in prison, but we must also increase the use of punishment outside of prison too. And this sentencing review will be tasked with pursuing these goals. It will be led, I am pleased to say, by a former Lord Chancellor, David Gauke, a highly regarded minister who served in multiple roles across government, who has rightly gained the respect of both the judiciary and the legal sector, as well as many within this House. And I will work with him to assemble a panel of reviewers who will draw together deep expertise and experience in the criminal justice system. This review will take a bipartisan and evidence-based look at an issue that has, for far too long, been a political football booted around by both sides. David Gauke will report back with his recommendations in the spring, and I have placed a copy of the complete terms of reference of the review in the library of the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is right that the review is given time to do its work. But as I have noted already, the capacity crisis in our prisons has not gone away. When we introduced emergency measures, we believed that they had brought us around a year. However, after the summer of disorder, the next crisis could be just 9 months away. For that reason, I announced last week an extension of magistrates' court sentencing powers, which allows us to bear down on the remand population in our prisons. But we must go further. And while I will not countenance any further emergency releases of prisoners, there are operational measures that I will lay before the House in the months ahead. The first, which I've already referenced, is home detention curfew. This modern form of house arrest curtails freedom and helps offenders turn their lives around. Offenders are subject to electronically monitored curfews, which must be imposed for 9 hours a day, are generally 12 hours long, and can in fact extend to 16 hours. As the Shadow Lord Chancellor himself noted in this House in February of this year, the reoffending rate for the average prisoner when measured a few years ago is close to 50%, but for offenders released on a home detention curfew, it is 23%. This government will soon extend the use of this measure, following in the footsteps of the last administration, who expanded its use rightly on a number of occasions. We will increase the maximum period eligible offenders can spend under house arrest from 6 months to 12 months. The second measure that we will introduce will address the soaring recall population, which has doubled from 6,000 to 12,000 in just 6 years. Risk-assessed recall review is a power of the Secretary of State to re-release on licence those who pose a low risk to the public, avoiding the long waits that they often face for a parole board hearing. In the past, this measure was used often. Between 2017 and 2019, it was used between 1,000 and 1,500 times each year. In recent years, its use has fallen to as low as 92 times in 2022. Later this month, I intend to review the risk-assessed recall review process so that lower risk cases can be considered for re-release after they have been recalled to prison for 2 to 3 months, where their further detention is no longer necessary to protect the public. And I should note that this will only change the cases that can be considered for release, with the final decision still in the hands of experienced probation officers and managers. The final area where I intend to make progress is in the case of foreign national offenders. I share the public's view that with 10,000 in our prisons, there are far too many foreign offenders in this country, costing £50,000 a year each to house at His Majesty's pleasure. It happens to be my personal view that deportation is as good a punishment as imprisonment, if not better. We are currently on track to remove more foreign national offenders this year than at any time in recent years. But I will now be working with my colleagues across government to explore the ways that we can accelerate this further, including working with the Home Office to make the early removal scheme for foreign offenders more effective. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I walked into the Ministry of Justice for the first time as Lord Chancellor just over 3 months ago, I encountered a prison system on the brink of collapse. This was the result of the inaction of the last government, who thought they could dither and delay and led us to the precipice of disaster. But their failure was actually longer in the making. They failed to build the prison places that this country needs, and they failed to address the challenge of an ever-rising prison population. In July, this government took action to avert the immediate disaster. But the plan that I have set out today does more than that. It will ensure that this government and its successors are never forced to rely on the emergency release of prisoners again, a measure over which I had no choice, that I took despite my personal beliefs, and that must never happen again. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Ed Argar.